Hey everyone, Nathaniel here with Beginner Food, and today we're going to be talking about cooking meat. And today we've got in front of us a great looking ribeye right here, but we're going to be talking about how to pick your meat out at the grocery store, what kind of cooking techniques you should use for what kind of meat, and how to make sure that you're getting the best results from whether you're doing it on the grill, in the oven, in a pot, or on the stovetop. So don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll jump right in. All right, so the first thing with cooking meats is looking at the meat that you have and making sure you're using the right cooking technique. So this is one that most people will be familiar with. This is a steak here, which is going to be a piece of meat that's cut against the grain, which means against the muscle grain. So the grain here is going up and down, and they cut against it, perpendicular, right like that. That allows the meat to be much more tender, allows you to bite through it without having to bite through those muscle fibers. If all the muscle fibers went this way in your steak, you'd be trying to bite through those muscle fibers instead of between them. So making sure you know how is your meat actually, I guess, kind of constructed, how that muscle fiber is going to make a difference. And then we're going to look at things like connective fibers and how much fat is in it. All right, so let's talk about marbling. Marbling is the fat that's kind of interstitial throughout the meat. All these little white specks and lines here, that's actually fat. There's fat there because the cow doesn't actually use these muscles a lot, and so the cow gets kind of fat and flabby. That's really good for us in terms of flavor and juiciness. That fat will turn to a liquid as you cook. Basically, all meat has some amount of fat. Some's gonna have more than others, and that's what's going to determine how juicy your meat is at the end of the day. If we compare this to, say, a chicken breast, where there's pretty much no fat in there, which is why chicken breast is really great for those on a diet, you'll know that chicken breast is a lot drier than a steak is. It's also going to have less flavor than a steak is. And that's pretty much why, is because this section here doesn't have as much fat in it. All right, so the other thing that we really want to talk about when picking out meat and choosing how to cook it is connective fiber, connective tissue. So things like this. This is going to be where muscle attaches to bone, for example. Like if we had a bone-in ribeye, there would be a bone right over here, and there would have to be something connecting the muscle fiber to that bone. Tendons, ligaments, and between the muscle fibers themselves, there's connective tissue. The more connective tissue in your meat, the longer and slower you're going to want to cook it. And a lot of the times it's going to be directly proportional to the size of the muscle fibers themselves. The bigger the muscle fibers, you're generally going to see more connective tissue. The smaller the muscle fibers, the less connective tissue. What's great about that is as connective tissue cooks, it breaks down into gelatin, which makes things basically thicker. It makes it stick to your fingers. That really savory feeling of like a gravy or like a fried chicken has a lot of basically connective tissue that's been broken down and really gives your mouth a full feel of flavor and texture. So a steak is probably not going to do that. There's not a lot of that really rich gelatin in here, but something like a short rib or a pot roast will. And so when you cook those out, you get that really nice gelatinous sauce, that gravy at the end. So that's something to keep an eye out for when you're picking your meat and deciding how to cook it. Wouldn't recommend taking a steak, putting it into a pot and cooking it for 2 hours, but it would be a great idea to do with a piece of chuck or like a London broil or something like that. All right, so one of the most important things with cooking any meat is making sure it's seasoned. Now this is going to do more than one thing. First, when we add salt, obviously we are creating flavor. Salt is a flavor enhancer. You put salt on something, it will taste more like whatever it is. But what is also happening is that salt is going to draw moisture out of whatever you put it on. Makes sense. When you salt something, it starts drying it out a little bit. And that might sound bad, but it's actually not. What's happening is water-soluble proteins are moving from the inside of the meat up to the surface of the meat. You can already see some of the salt has disappeared. because it's starting to draw that moisture out. As those proteins come to the surface, they're actually going to react with how we're cooking it. You guys will probably have heard of caramelization. When you take sugar and apply heat to it, it turns into caramel. With meat, it's called the Maillard reaction. And that's the same idea, just with protein. So as the protein comes up to the surface, we have more protein that will go into the Maillard reaction and create flavor. So when we see that browning, we can develop a better crust. Those of you who've had a steak know that a steak with a nice brown crust is better than a steak with a gray crust. And that's where it comes from. It is the caramelization of the proteins, not really caramelization, but again, through the Maillard reaction. How do we maximize that? By seasoning with salt, drawing that moisture out, those proteins up to the surface, and then applying heat. So that's how seasoning works. It's gonna do one more thing on proteins like chicken, pork, anything that really dries out. That salt's gonna do one more thing. The longer you let it sit, it's going to dissolve basically the muscle fibers and the myosin within them that constricts and forces juice and liquid out of the meat. It's not really gonna do it on our steak, but it will do it on all poultry items and most pork ones too. Is if you've ever seen a chicken breast shrink when you cook it and force out a lot of liquid, and you have dry turkey, dry chicken, add salt to it, let it sit for a day, that salt will actually break down those muscle fibers, it'll prevent it from constricting, and you'll end up with a juicier, plumper piece of meat at the end. But for our steak here, mostly for flavor and to get the proteins out. All right, so it's been about 10-15 minutes since we salted both sides of our meat, and you can see all the salt is no longer visible. It's drawn the moisture out of the meat. You can see a little bit of it pooling right there and over here on the sides, and that's from the salt. Now those proteins that were water soluble have also moved from the center of the meat up towards the surface of the meat. So now when we put them on our hot grill, they'll basically brown up nice and create a crust on our steak. So next thing we're gonna do, we're gonna go ahead and get the grill ready. All right, so we've been letting our grill come up to temperature for about 10 minutes. It's really important that you do it for one, make sure your grill's nice and clean. That temperature, that heat's gonna go ahead and it's gonna burn anything off that's on there. It's also gonna make sure that your food is cooking the moment you put it on. All those grill grates are gonna store that heat energy, and introducing cold meat is going to start cooking rather than, having cold metal pressed up against your food. So we're gonna go ahead and open that up. It's gonna be crazy hot. As you can see, we've got our steak here. We're gonna put a little bit of oil on both sides and just rub that on. And now we're ready to put the steak on the grill. Very, very hot. We can go ahead and turn that down now. Close the top. That'll also help put the flames out. All right, so at about 60 seconds, we're gonna flip it over and we should have kind of a nice brown sear. And we're just gonna go ahead, repeat for about another minute, minute and a half. If you've got a really hot grill, definitely be looking at a minute for a steak this thin. All right, so we've turned off the grill. We're pretty much done now. Make sure you use your handy meat thermometer and check for the temperature. We want something kind of between 125, 130. Any of those numbers are gonna be good. You're gonna go for the thick pieces right there, and we should be seeing, there we go, 133, 127. That's done. We can now take our steak off and let it rest. Pull this guy off, put it on our board. All right, so here we have our steak off of the grill. This steak is actually pretty thin. You can see it's about 1 knuckle, so a little bit under an inch thick. That's why we're cooking it so hot and so fast. Basically, the thinner your meat is, the faster you're gonna wanna cook it. If it's really thick, you're gonna wanna sear and then finish off the middle slowly. But this is a nice thin one here, so we cooked this one in really only 2-3 minutes on a super high heat. Next thing we gotta do is we have to let it sit. We wanna let it rest. Especially with high heat cooking, like on a grill on high, you're creating liquid pressure within the meat. That's what forces all those juices out. That's what dries it out. By resting your meat, you're allowing that pressure to equalize throughout the meat, redistribute those juices, and so that way they're not gonna be bursting like a water balloon when you cut into this. So we cooked this for about 3 minutes. We're gonna let it rest for at least 3 minutes. If you're cooking a larger piece for 10 minutes or so, let it rest for at least 5. All right, so now we've let the meat rest for about 3.5 minutes for our really quick and fast cook time. Now it's time to cut it. Now again, when we're talking about meat, we're talking about how the texture and the mouthfeel is gonna be. You can now see the grains of the meat much more prominently now that we've cooked it. You can see right here, the cap, the grains going like this. You can see right there where it's split a little, right there where it's split a little. So we want to cut this way against that grain, 90 degrees. That's going to give us the smallest fibers of meat for each bite. The other thing with steaks is never cut them too thin. If you cut it too thin this way, it's going to get cold and it's going to dry out a lot faster. So we want to make sure we preserve a little bit of meat. And there we go. So cut about 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch. And you can see there's our nice pink middle and our nice brown crust. All right, so you can see here, we've already eaten a couple pieces, but we've got our light pink on the outside, our slightly darker pink on the inside. It is warm all the way through, which, just like our thermometer said, we're looking at the low 130s for that medium rare flavor. As far as juice goes, we can see here, our steak is nice and juicy, and that is again from all that marbling, all that fat. You can see it right there, all coming out. But it's not all over our cutting board. Our cutting board isn't getting soaked, and that's because we let it rest. There we go, see it's a nice fresh right there. And nice and juicy piece of steak. And here we have our perfectly cooked medium rare steak, but really this is gonna work for whatever kind of meat you wanna pick. What's really important is make sure you season it well, let it rest, make sure you're picking the right cooking technique for the kind of meat you're buying. If it's a steak, you're gonna go hot and fast. If it's gonna have a lot of connective tissue or big muscle fibers, you're gonna go low, slow, and maybe wet in a braise or a broth. So that's all for today. Remember to like and subscribe and check us out on Beginner Food.